There we go. Sorry. I'd like to welcome Scott Dibiasio and Brian Rodgers to speak with us today, give us a state and federal legislative update. Scott Dibiasio is the Manager of State and Industry Affairs, and Brian Rodgers is the Manager of Federal Affairs with the Appraisal Institute. So I am going to leave it to them, but welcome to you both. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. And I think the easiest thing for us to do first is to introduce ourselves. Like Vanessa said, I'm Scott Dibiasio. I'm the Manager of State and Industry Affairs, been with the Institute for about 15 years now. So, Brian?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Brian Rodgers. I'm Manager of Federal Affairs. With the Institute, I've been here about 15 years now. Work with Bill Garber, who you may know from in the DC office, now in our Virginia basement, I guess, but been there about 15 years working on federal issues, Congress, federal agencies, things like that, LDEC.
And just so everybody knows, Brian and I are gonna do a little bit of a ping pong here because we do want to cover a lot of both federal and state legislative and regulatory issues. And the way that we have the PowerPoint set up is that we cover one of the primary issues, both from the federal and the state level up front, and then we can go into some other topics and some other legislative and regulatory information towards the end of the presentation. But the bulk of our talk here today is going to be focused on really the issues that Brian and I have been spending a significant portion of our time on really over the last 4 or 5 years or so. And of course, these issues shouldn't be any news to you because they have been very well publicized, both within the industry as well as in the mainstream media. And of course, we're talking about allegations that people of color have received valuations of their property that are lower than they should be, and that those valuations were somehow based upon the person's characteristics. And of course, there's also some issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the profession. Statistics have shown that the profession is 98% white, a majority male, and the average age now I think is over 60 years old, perhaps even pushing 65 years old. So we don't have a lot of credibility on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues when our own profession is lacking in all 3 of those categories. So just lay out the framework here just real quick. I've got the first 2 bullet points, and then Brian's going to take over to just lay the baseline for how we got to where we are right now. And I think it all goes back to about 2018 or so, when Dr. Andre Perry with the Brookings Institution published his really landmark research on the issues related to devaluation of Black and Brown owned residential properties. And of course, he found that there was significant devaluation that created a significant wealth gap, or contributed to the wealth gap between Black and people of color. So of course that touched off a number of different media stories and reports. There were, several highly publicized cases where appraisers had allegedly devalued properties that were owned by Black or mixed race couples. I'm sure you've all heard the scenarios where 2 different appraisals. The first one, the Black property owner greets the appraiser. The appraiser does the inspection, and the value of the property is lower than what the property owner thought it would be. So they through whatever mechanism, commission a second appraisal and have somebody that is not of color stand in for them. The second appraisal comes in at a higher value than the first one. We've seen stories in the New York Times, we've seen stories on ABC News, all kinds of local reporting on these issues. So it has been very, very well publicized, some of the allegations that are being made against real estate appraisers. And not surprisingly, the federal lawmakers, both at the congressional level and at the administration, stepped in very quickly. And Brian's going to tell you a little bit about some of the things that happened, that got us to where we are with the issues we're dealing with today.
Sure. And Scott, will you just leave the screen up there? And
Sure.
okay,
Yeah.
great.
I'll have to control the slides for you. Sorry.
Yep. No, it's fine. It makes it smoother probably. All right. Well, so that's a good setup, and then you might remember back in 2019 when then President of the AI, Stephen Wagner, testified in the House Financial Services Committee. We just thought, we were going to discuss, the appraisal licensing legislation and other appraisal issues, but the hearing became an issue focused on appraisal bias. I wouldn't say it was hijacked by the issue, but it was part of the makeup of the hearing was that issue, but that became the topic of the issue. And that's where I would say it started. I think Congressman Al Green from Texas, if you remember, he said, everybody raise your hand. Does anybody believe that there's, racism in appraisals or bias in appraisals? And I think nobody raised their hand except Dr. Perry from the Brookings Institute, if I remember correctly. So that sort of started us. That was the presidential election was starting to gear up. And I think that was when Biden campaign talked about appraisal bias as a campaign issue, part of his housing issues pretty much. And I think the Brookings Institution, Dr. Perry was a part of that campaign actually. Then he was elected president, and then he spoke if you remember early in his tenure, he spoke at the Tulsa, commemorating the Tulsa race massacre. And there he pledged to refocus on the appraisal issue and housing. And he appointed the task force on appraisals that became the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity Task Force. Now, you probably all heard a lot about that at this point. They call it PAVE, we call it PAVE. They released their action plan in late spring. And the PAVE task force is not done with just the action plan. They continue to meet and work on the implementation of the plan, but we see several themes starting to emerge from the work of the task force. The task force members are honing in on the appraisal standards and qualifications issues, as evidenced by letters and communications sent by the agencies to the boards of the Appraisal Foundation. The Appraisal Standards Board has admitted exposure period relating to the change of the USPAP ethics rule that's aimed at addressing concerns expressed by agencies related to fair housing law recognition and prioritization within appraisal standards. Likewise, the AQB is developing proposals relating to valuation bias and fair housing training requirements for appraisers, with those proposals expected to be released for exposure in the coming months. Also, the standards and guidance relating to reconsideration of value processes and procedures under development. We see the Consumer Financial Protection Agency recently penned a blog post on the ROV policies, and work within the Office of Comptroller Currency has been underway for several months now related to this topic. We definitely see this as part of future work streams in the agencies and guidance developments. So reconsideration of value is one we should be paying close attention to. With that, big part of the action plan was diversity efforts, and they talked very warmly about our efforts here. It remains prominent within the agency still, though, in the appraisal profession as programs like our ADI, which is we partnered with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Urban League. That's got a lot of attention, ADI, in the PAVE report, and ADI currently has more than 300 scholarship winners in the program, with about 60 or so scholarship winners who have completed the trainee package. So there's a broad recognition and support for furthering these efforts. Also, around the same time the PAVE report came out was you may recall the appraisal subcommittee partnered with the Council of Licensure, Enforcement, and Regulation. And they released a report that was highly critical of the governance of the appraisal industry, and specifically the lack of oversight of the Appraisal Foundation. The lack of diversity in the makeup of the standards and qualifications boards, more specifically, and Report also calls the experience requirements for appraisers a barrier to entry and calls for consumers to be considered an intended user of the report. So that's pretty big. The group also examined closely whether the barriers to entry into the profession exist that disparately impact minorities and result in a lack of diversity in the profession. Specifically, they pointed to college degree requirements, qualifying education hours, and experience requirements, in particular, the requirements to find a supervisor, as being particularly burdensome and creating a clear racial disparate impact. They demanded a thorough review of the experience hour requirement, likely leading to the elimination of the requirement entirely in favor of more robust education, more comprehensive licensing examination. They recommended the completion of required education, passage of an exam, maybe that should result in a certified appraiser. The report overall, it didn't get much attention nationally, in my personal opinion, in the housing groups. But frankly, it did get the attention of one person in particular, the House Financial Service Committee Chairwoman Maxine Waters. She has staff who used to work with one of the groups there that was part of the report. So that's something she's well aware of, and I'll have some more information on that in a little bit. 2022 congressional hearings, shortly after the PAVE action plan was released, hearings were held in both the House and the Senate. The Senate went first, and they focused strictly on pretty closely just the action plan, the PAVE action plan that is, with Jim Park, you may remember, executive director of the subcommittee, testified along with a member of the PAVE task force. The hearing just focused on the action plan, and not many fireworks on that, to be honest. It was a pretty good hearing, just focused on the issues. In the House, though, a broader hearing was held, and you may recall that AI President Jody Bishop testified. The main focus was the PAVE report and the broader issue of appraisal bias, but we were sort of planning for the worst. We had no idea what's coming out of the hearing, but we thought it was actually more constructive than we expected. We try to keep the focus on the positive things going on in the industry, like we're talking about the ADI initiative and the focus on reconsideration value, and the fact that we partnered with PAVE a little bit as far as doing a ride along with PAVE members. We had appraisers from Maryland and DC take some of the staff along on a ride along on appraisal, so they got to really see what a residential appraisal sort of a day in the life was like. So I thought that had a positive contribution to the PAVE report. So that both those hearings were pretty constructive. I think we can turn it, Scott. Yep. So then next, though, was issue of valuation bias and what was happening in Congress at the same time. First is the Housing Fairness Act, HR 68 and S 769. In the House, it was introduced by Emanuel Cleaver from Missouri. This bill would just focus on, actually, this is Housing Fairness Act was just a broader bill introduced by Al Green, I think. And this was intended to look more generally at housing disparities. It isn't simply focused on appraisals, but the House bill has been approved by the House Financial Service Committee in late June. No vote by the full House yet. But that does look at, just discrimination in housing, and they were looking for funding civil rights groups, perhaps they were maybe catch appraisers, catch realtors acting out in bias, steering clients in a different direction or things like that. But that wasn't a strictly appraisal bill. But similarly, though, broader bill was HR 2553, the Real Estate Valuation Fairness and Improvement Act. That's the bill introduced by Emanuel Cleaver. He's one of the chairmen of the subcommittees, one of the subcommittees of the House Financial Service Committee. So this bill was introduced back in April 2021. You may have heard about it already, but it does require the formation of a task force made up of the banking regulators, industry stakeholders like AI, for example, who identify best practices and help develop more consistent policies and procedures for federal agencies. This was looked at as a way to sort of be, like it says, be more consistent across the agencies. Different agencies have different policies for appraisals, and we were looking for how can this be streamlined a little bit. Items they could look at appraisals, AVMs, reconsideration value, common collateral underwriting challenges such as energy efficient issues, inactive markets. But they also they decided the legislation to also direct the task force to study potential racial disparities within the lending and valuation and investigate any barriers to entry that disproportionately affect minorities from starting a career as a valuation professional. Sort of like the minimal requirements, like we spoke with the AQB board. Legislation also directs the appraisal subcommittee to establish a program to make grants available to state agencies, nonprofit organizations like AI, for example, and higher education institutions to to promote diversity and inclusion within the valuation profession. That all might sound pretty familiar because it was largely then co-opted by the Biden administration as the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity Task Force, PAVE. We don't expect any movement then with this bill at this point, but the grant funding element promoting diversity and inclusion is part of was taken as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. I'll have a little bit more on that later. So just the one part of the grant which was taken from this bill. So the rest of the bill probably we're coming up to the end of the term for Congress, so this is probably it at this point. Now, going back to my point about the Appraisal Subcommittee and CLEAR report, one of the groups who worked on the report is the National Fair Housing Coalition. They have direct contacts with Maxine Waters, chair of the House Financial Service Committee. So she did not miss this report. So this has led to a draft bill, which was noticed as part of the hearing where Jody Bishop testified. Notice meaning it was part of the list of bills they're going to consider discussing and talking about during the hearing. The bill is referred to as the Fair Appraisal Inequity Reform Act of 2022, which would do a number of things. Overall, it creates a Federal Valuation Agency, essentially blending the subcommittee and foundation. Mandates a fair housing qualifying and continuing education, makes all appraisals publicly available, allocates money for federal investigation of appraisers, establishes procedures for processing and appraisal discrimination complaints, and imposes stiffer penalties for the appraisal-related violations of the Fair Housing Act. As you see, it requires the respondent to submit all appraisals performed in the previous 24 months with just a discrimination complaint. Excuse me. We see this bill really as this draft, I should say, as affecting the future profession. More regulation and penalties with no mention of due process. And it could impact the bottom line for appraisers. It makes the profession definitely looks a lot less attractive at a time when there's a really need to bring the new generation to the industry, which becomes a harder sell with this kind of legislation. The good news is here, it's just a draft bill and has not been introduced. We're at the end of this legislation session's approaching, it becomes more and more unlikely to pass. It had to get past the committee at this point, it had to be introduced, past the committee, past the House, introduced in the Senate, pass, et cetera. We're talking there's going to be a month or so left after the election. But we have heard the HUD secretary was pushing senators to include similar language in a different bill. That got rejected. But till the clock strikes midnight in this legislative term, we've got to keep our guard up on this issue. I really don't expect anything to happen with it now, but it's something to keep our eye on. We're continuing to meet with the staff on this issue. Also, the fair housing enforcement, we've heard there's well over 100 appraisal-related fair housing complaints that have been filed over at HUD. Several of these complaints have already resulted in conciliation agreements at this point. However, these complaints have also raised questions as to whether there is even sufficient expertise within HUD in order to fairly and adequately investigate these complaints. We don't know how many appraisers they have on staff. I think we've heard there's a few at least, but there's 100 or plus complaints really are those being investigated thoroughly. And also over the summer, the CFPB has said they're looking into that's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, said they're looking into some unfair, deceptive, and abusive acts or practices. One of the concerns addresses the use of words that can be viewed as being discriminatory found in some appraisals. I think this was in the Fannie or Freddie report as well, that this could be a situation where the CFPB is getting impatient with HUD's review of the Fair Housing Act complaints I mentioned and might act on their own. So please be careful with what you write in your reports. Also be careful where you get your information from. We've heard some of the appraisals being investigated include neighborhood info cut and pasted from Wikipedia that use words or phrases that should no longer be used. So be careful there. So now next we move into some state legislation.
Great, thanks, Brian. And the state legislatures and state appraiser regulatory agencies have also taken a very keen interest in this issue. And there have been a couple of bills that have been passed over the last couple of years, and there's a couple that are still pending. In California, they passed last year a very, very comprehensive piece of legislation that's referred to as the Fair Appraisal Act. It does a number of different things. It requires certain language to be included in sales contracts and in lending documents. relaying to the property purchaser or the borrower the fact that they are entitled to a fair and equitable valuation of their property and an appraisal that is independent and objective. That language must be included in sales contracts as well as in lending documents. It also requires their state Bureau of Real Estate Appraisal to collect certain demographic information as it relates to complaints that are submitted to them where there is an allegation of valuation bias or discrimination on the part of the appraiser. Vanessa, did you have a question? I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I think my main question, back to what Brian was saying with regard to the potential draft legislation, is that going to affect appraisals across the board, or is it only those that are with, federally related financing transactions, or how, what would be affected?
That's a good question. I think that I believe that's federal related transactions. At this point, I mean, I don't know, that the language is not, the bill itself, the draft at the time is not specific as far as I know with that, but I'm federal related transactions, I presume.
Thank
And were they looking at residential too, mostly? I mean, so much of this is focused on residential. That's where I believe they're looking at mostly, but I think that everything federal related will fall into it though.
Great. So there's a couple of other states, Illinois and Maryland, that have passed the legislation to form a couple of different task forces that are very similar to the property appraisal and valuation equity task force that Brian referred to at the federal level. In fact, the makeup of these groups, as well as what they are charged with doing, in both cases almost comes exclusively and verbatim from the task that was put on the PAVE group, and the issues that they were charged with investigating and reporting on. So there's been a lot of copying, if you will, of what is taking place at the federal level, also at the state level. In New Jersey, there's a couple of different bills pending related to housing and appraisal discrimination. There's some continuing education requirements that are included in there, and there is some reiteration of already existing law that says that appraisal discrimination is illegal. That's true both at the federal level as well as at the state level, and in some cases there are even local ordinances prohibiting appraisal discrimination. Going back to California, this is again, a fairly comprehensive bill. I talked about the disclosure requirements and the collection of demographic data. That piece of legislation also included a mandatory continuing education requirement for all appraisers in California, and that will take effect on January 1st of 2023. And we're going to talk a little bit more about mandatory continuing education here in just a second. And in fact, here we go. There were a couple of states that already had education requirements in place related to fair housing, dating back to 2008. Ohio had a requirement that all aspiring appraisers take one course devoted specifically to fair housing related issues, and that was as part of their qualifying education. And New York had a similar requirement for appraiser assistants in that state, their version of the trainee, to take a 15-hour qualifying education course on both three issues, really: fair housing, fair lending, and they also included environmental issues within the requirements for that course. And then just in the last couple of years, I talked about California. There have been a couple of other states that have either put in place or are in the process of putting in place continuing education requirements for appraisers on valuation bias issues, discrimination, fair housing, etc. Switching gears just slightly, I wanted to talk a little bit about PAREA because I think it is an integral part of the industry's efforts to address issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, PAREA stands for the practical applications of real estate appraisal. And like I said, PAREA is an important part of the industry's efforts to make the profession look more demographically like America. And research has shown that people of color have a disproportionately more difficult time finding supervisors. And I think that makes sense when you look at the fact that the industry is 98% white, and you know, there are fewer Black supervisors that are willing to take on trainees. So those folks have a much more difficult time finding supervisors, and I think that PAREA is going to streamline the process and make the profession easier to access on the part of communities of color. And of course, I should have said PAREA stands for the Practical Applications of Real Estate Appraisal. It's an alternative way for an aspiring appraiser to satisfy the experience requirements to become licensed. Of course, right now, the only method of gaining experience to become an appraiser is as a trainee working under a supervisor for the required number of hours and the required amount of time. PAREA is a technology-based way for somebody to get their experience in a simulated environment, applying both methods and techniques, again, in a simulated environment. PAREA came about from the AQB. It was first authorized in 2021. And since that time, the AQB has reviewed, I believe it is 7 now, concept papers from potential PAREA developers. And one of those concept papers was from the Appraisal Institute. And we'll talk a little bit about the status of our PAREA program here in just a couple of seconds. As it relates to PAREA, obviously this is a paradigm shift in the industry, and state regulators are having to grapple with how they are going to incorporate PAREA into their laws and regulations. I'm happy to say that state uptake and acceptance of PAREA is gaining momentum. There are 36 states now that have indicated to one degree or another that they will accept PAREA to satisfy the experience requirements. However, there are still 19 other jurisdictions that are in various different stages of talking about PAREA and whether or not they want to incorporate it into their rules and regulations. And North Carolina is one of the states where the North Carolina Appraisal Board did write some regulations regarding PAREA to allow for its use in North Carolina. There was a comment period. There was a rulemaking hearing. Many comments were submitted, both in support of PAREA as well as some that were not in favor of altering the traditional method of gaining experience. And ultimately, the North Carolina Appraisal Board voted to approve those regulations and to put in place an allowance for the use of PAREA in North Carolina. One thing that is unique to North Carolina is that there is a multi-layered rule review process, both on the part of the Rules Review Commission, as well as potentially on the part of the state legislature. And what happened here is that folks that were not necessarily supportive of the concept of PAREA did submit enough comments to the Rules Review Commission to have the PAREA related rules referred to the legislature for their review when they come back into session in January. And it's possible that a piece of legislation could be introduced to disapprove of the PAREA related rules, which would basically send everybody back to the drawing board as it relates to PAREA in North Carolina. What we have heard just in the last couple of weeks is that the main group, the North Carolina Association of Realtors, that was recommending a deferred effective date for these rules so that the legislature could undertake their review process. They've since backed off of that a little bit, and we're not really certain at this point that there is going to be a piece of legislation to disapprove of the rules as they were proposed by the North Carolina Appraisal Board. We're being told that the realtors, put in the comments to get the rules reviewed or petitioned to the legislature simply as a way to sort of slow the process down so that they had the benefit of more time to see exactly what PAREA programs were going to be coming into the marketplace, what they were going to look like, and so on. So we're hopeful that we won't have to fight this out in the legislature during the first part of 2023, but it is certainly possible. In my opinion, if the North Carolina Association of Realtors were to do that, I think they would have a difficult time convincing the legislature that rules that would review or lower a barrier to entry into the profession should not be approved. And this is especially true because if you'll recall, probably about 5 years or so ago now, North Carolina reinstituted the licensed residential appraiser license. And that was part of an overall discussion by the legislature about reducing regulatory barriers to entry into the profession and specifically into the appraisal profession. So I think if the North Carolina Association of Realtors were to go in and say that they were in favor of keeping an existing barrier to entry into the profession in place, they may have a difficult time convincing the legislature that disapproving these rules is the right thing to do. So rest assured that both the North Carolina chapter as well as us in Washington are keeping very close tabs on this, and we'll be prepared to respond accordingly depending on what path this process ultimately goes down. And in terms of where the Appraisal Institute stands, we are in fact developing a PAREA program. The AI Board of Directors authorized up to $2.5 million for development, and we were fortunate enough to get a grant, conditional grant from the Appraisal Foundation in the amount of $500,000. So the overall cost of our development of a PAREA program is likely to push $3 million. And that process is well underway. And while we do have a delivery commitment of September of 2023, I'm hearing that the process is moving along a lot quicker than we thought it was going to be. And it is somewhat likely that we will have a product ready to bring to the market prior to that commitment that we have of September of 2023. So some good news there. Things are well ahead of schedule, and we're likely to see AI's PAREA program probably sometime, I would say, second quarter, maybe third quarter of 2023. And I'm going to move through this very quickly. We do have some limited time today. These are just some snapshots from our PAREA program that I wanted you to be able to get a sense as to exactly what our program is going to look like. Here you can see different property types. It's broken up into different modules. Somebody that's going through this, would be involved at some point in the appraisal of vacant land, the appraisal of co-ops, single family units, as well as 2 to 4 family and vacant land. Drilling down a little bit farther, I actually should have switched these slides because I think this one goes before the last one, but this is just obviously the welcome screen. And then digging down a little bit deeper into whatever property type it is that the person is, the student is looking at that point. Obviously, the different steps of the appraisal process, they would be required to, go through each of those steps and to, apply what they've learned in their education appropriately to these simulated types of environments. And again, drilling down a little bit deeper here into the identification of the problem, and then some of the actual assignments and work that someone in a PAREA program would be engaged in. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Brian to talk about some other non-valuation bias and DE&I related federal legislation. So Brian, take it away.
Looks like we have a hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
It's okay. Looks a quick question.
I was late. I just wanted to, so I thought I saw that an email had gone out as we're looking for mentors.
Yes.
For PAREA. And so what are the requirements, I guess, for that? Because a lot of us are commercial. So would that be something that we could do as commercial appraisers?
Absolutely. The only requirements are for the mentors in our PAREA program to be designated members of the Appraisal Institute, either SRA or MAI. And the only other requirement is that I believe you have to go through a mentor orientation course that is very similar to the supervisor trainee course that you have to take if you want to supervise appraisers. But other than that, I think they're going to be looking for well-seasoned appraisers to serve as mentors, but they haven't put in place any specific requirements for amount of time that you've been in the profession, the type of work that you do, so on and so forth. So, commercial appraisers are welcome to apply to be mentors, just like your residential counterparts. I will say that the position is compensated. So there is a little bit of an incentive there for you to participate and to become a mentor to aspiring appraisers. You can take on, multiple students that are participating in PAREA. If you're a supervisor right now, in most states, you're limited to only having 3 trainees. I don't know. I don't think that there's going to be a limit on the number of students that you can be mentoring at any one specific time. So there may be some folks in the profession that decide that, they want to take on being a mentor as a majority of their practice at this point. Perhaps they're, transitioning out of the profession or looking forward to retirement. And perhaps, this would be one way for them to sort of transition out of the profession, but also to give back to the profession through mentorship. So I would strongly encourage you all to take a look at that. I think it could be a very rewarding experience for you. And again, it is a compensated position. I don't know at this point how much they will be paying per student, but certainly it's better than what you're compensated for having a trainee, which in most cases is nothing, and in fact actually costs you a lot of time and money in the form of lost opportunity. So we're trying to address that situation, trying to make it a little bit more attractive for people to want to become mentors of people in PAREA.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott.
All right, well, back to federal legislation. As Scott mentioned, we're moving past the valuation bias topics, but still somewhat related is legislation you're already aware of by now. Perhaps HR 5756, the Portal for Appraisal Licensing Act. This bipartisan bill has been introduced in now 2 consecutive Congresses, so every 2 years is Congress. This was introduced. The previous one is not as well, with the same original co-sponsors, Congressman Ed Perlmutter, a Democrat from Colorado, and David Kustoff, a Republican from Tennessee. Now, if you're not familiar with legislation, what the bill does is it establishes a cloud-based nationwide licensing system for state appraiser certification licensing, along the lines of regulatory structures in other industries, like the NMLS for mortgage brokers. Essentially, one-stop shopping for licensing and renewals. Also establishes consistent procedures for continuing education, renewal time periods for certified and licensed appraisers, and conducting a common background check for states that require background check. It's something we've long advocated for states to coordinate the licensing functions through a common platform. With this legislation, we get closer to that. I know so many of our members, and many of you perhaps, are work in multiple states and have to get licensed in multiple states, and education, multiple states, and many background checks, and it can be really tough at times, and especially during the COVID period where a lot of things were closed and you had to travel and you didn't want to travel, and that was a big issue then. And this is just sort of modernizes the system at this point, streamlines it. Doesn't really deregulate. The state agencies are still getting their money, their fees. This is sort of, it works consistent with the PAVE action plan as far as sharing information across state lines. This is all real-time information, so state agencies can track if somebody loses their license in South Carolina, they move to North Carolina, they can see that. So it's effective in that way as well. So it's, I know if any LDACers on the line, you're probably familiar with this legislation. We've been discussing it for years, it seems like. At this point, with the election coming quickly, we know there's not much time left for this to pass, but legislation like this, it often just takes a few terms to break through, and I think we're coming to that point. There's a Senate version of the bill drafted, and it's close to being introduced. We felt it could be any day now. They just want to make sure it's bipartisan, so they're just kind of working through some issues at this point, but we're hoping to get a Senate bill now. But once this Congress, assuming it doesn't pass the next month or two, which is a tall order, we assume that we'll be back again the next term, hopefully sooner this time, and we can get it going faster. And we'll have a Senate version as well. So that's a sort of a big win for us there. Let's see, next is the Home Buyer Assistance Act. The important thing to know about this bill is that it modifies FHA requirements to once again allow licensed residential appraisers to perform FHA appraisals. However, to do so, licensed appraisers have to complete a 7-hour course on FHA requirements. As it currently stands, appraisers have to be certified and take a test, but reportedly the FHA was just accepting certified appraisers without a test, assuming being certified was good enough to perform FHA appraisals, even though they're quite different from non-FHA appraisals. So this bill was included in the recently passed the House version of the National Defense Authorization Act. It's not in the Senate version of the bill, and so I'd be surprised if it makes it to President Biden's desk with a provision in it, but we'll be keeping an eye on that one. The Appraisal Fee Transparency Act passed the House last term, but it hasn't been reintroduced this session yet. However, we keep hearing talks that it could be reintroduced, especially in the Senate. We heard as of yesterday, they're still looking at this bill, and maybe include this could be a vehicle for the just previously mentioned Portal for Appraiser Licensing Act too. As you see, one of the big provisions in it would amend RESPA and require the disclosure of appraisal fees. So basically separating the appraisal fee from the AMC fee. That's something we've been trying to push for years. And it does other things like add a designee of the the VA to the appraisal subcommittee, and allows the ASC to adjust annual registry for AMCs. So it's kind of some little issues, but some big ones as well. But so we're tracking that one. We expect if it doesn't get introduced this term, it's going to be back next Congress as well. Another piece of legislation is the improving access to. It's introduced in the House and the Senate. It's the Improving Access to the VA Home Loan Benefit Act. As you see, if enacted, the legislation essentially calls for an overhaul of the VA appraisal process to essentially to conform with the GSEs. The bill's House sponsor is Rep. Mike Bost. He's the current ranking member of the VA committee in the House, and we're poised to take over as chairman if the Republicans take over the House in November's election, which is looking fairly likely at this point. His big complaint, I believe, pertains to appraisal turnaround time in the VA and shortage of VA appraisers. I know we've seen some numbers that say the turnaround times have gotten much better in recent times than they were a handful of years ago. We also think there are some groups out there who want to get rid of the VA appraisal panel, which have its ears as well. The concern with doing the VA appraisal panel is that if it happens, the veterans will no longer have the benefit of the Tidewater Initiative, which, if you don't know, is a benefit that gives interested parties the opportunity to provide additional sales data that can support the contract price if the appraisal comes in low. So I guess the VA will no longer be the client of the appraiser, so that changes that dynamic there. If the sponsors of the legislation clarified that the panel will remain in place and maybe even strengthened, we could have less concern about the legislation. I know the VA has some concerns about it. as well. So we're not sure what could happen with this bill, but it has passed the House. The Senate has some concerns about it, but you never know. This VA bills tend to be quite popular, and this is something that the lame duck, they could just say, well, this looks pretty good, we'll take that, especially if the VA backs down a little bit from it. A part of the VA Circular 26/2213, which was released, I think it was in late July, that addresses the VA alternative valuation methods and essentially continues the allowance for desktop and exterior only appraisals that first started in the early days of the COVID situation. The VA noted that according to USPAP, both desktop and exterior only appraisals can fulfill the requirements of USPAP as long as the analysis by the VA fee panel appraiser is credible. That was another provision of the legislation I just spoke about, was about the desktop appraisal. So that's another part of the legislation is kind of moot at this point if the VA already clarified that. So looking ahead, for a deep dive in the upcoming elections, I should say, as they relate to the financial services sector, you should check out the pre-election 2022 outlook from AI's government relations consulting firm, Rich Foyer Anderson. We just recently posted on the AI's website, so I recommend you taking a look at that. But looking at the greater appraisal issues in greater detail, there's several bills that could see action during the post-election lame duck session of Congress. With the election coming up in a couple of weeks, I believe Congress then comes back in mid-November, and probably there's no telling how long they'll be here, up to the holiday season, I guess. But that you never know you're going to get post-election. They'll try to maybe pass a few big items of business, but some people won't be very happy and won't be willing to work on some issues, and so you never know. But there is usually some must-pass things reserved for the lame duck session, and they usually need concurrence from both the respective chair and ranking members of the committee of jurisdiction, and so they get negotiated between all the House and Senate members. But bills that fall into this committee include as I mentioned, the National Defense Authorization Act. So it's already passed the House. It's a big defense bill, but it has a couple of appraisal provisions that I mentioned earlier as part of the NDA. That's the FHA bill with certified appraisers, as well as the as well as the Real Estate Valuation Fairness Act, which relates to the establishment of a grant program at the appraisal subcommittee for states, nonprofit organizations, higher education institutions, basically promoting diversity and inclusion in the appraisal profession. That provision would authorize up to $50 million towards that effort for over a 3-year period. But several questions about the authorization appropriation process and how it really would apply. The appraisal subcommittee as an independent agency is authorized by the National Defense Bill complicates the whole issue. I mean, and you need to have, like I said, the chairs of both committees in the House and the Senate, the ranking members, so Democrats and Republicans agreeing on this. And so I could see some of these things just being sort of tossed out, like it had nothing to do with defense. Let's get rid of these kind of things. So there's no telling, but it could have passed, sure, but I wouldn't expect those provisions to pass. Also in the lame duck, we could see S4808, which is the sort of major pension bill. It contains one provision added as an amendment during the Senate committee consideration that attempts to rein in the syndicated conservation easement transactions. You may have seen this has been bouncing around for a while as well. Those provisions have long been supported by AI and many national conservation organizations. We're reviewing the additional provisions added to the amendment while working with historic preservation advocates to address concerns about the unintended consequences. Originally, it was just the conservation easements. Then the historic preservations groups sort of jumped in there and amended that, so it addresses their concerns as well. But from what I understand is the historical preservation, the conservation easements are just totally, they're valued differently, they're taxed differently. So that's sort of a roadblock here. Now, chances for this legislation moving really are kind of moderate at this point, but given that it's including an important piece of legislation that's with some momentum, still several issues do need to resolve for it to receive clearance and passage. And the conservation syndication aspect of it really imposes limitation on the tax deduction for the qualified conservation contributions made by certain partnerships, as long as the amount doesn't exceed 2.5 times the sum of each partner's relevant basis. So it gets really into the weeds and taxes, but it's been something that's been very important to the conservation organizations and our partners there. And it's a small amount of appraisers that are doing that kind of work, I believe.
Well, great. Thanks, Brian. And I apologize for jumping the gun there a little bit on switching the slides. Wanted to get into just some other state legislation and regulation affecting the profession. Obviously, you saw the plethora of state legislative and regulatory activity as it relates to valuation bias and DE&I topics. But there are, in fact, other issues that state legislatures and appraiser regulatory agencies around the country are involved with. And we'll go through a couple of those. The statute, there were statutes of repose that have been enacted in Pennsylvania, Texas, and in Wisconsin. And for those of you that are not aware, a statute of repose that is specific to appraisers limits the time after which you complete an appraisal, during which you can be sued in civil court for things like negligent misrepresentation, professional malpractice, so on and so forth. And fortunately, North Carolina does have a long-standing statute of repose on civil suits against appraisers. So you do have some good protections there in North Carolina. I can't quote exactly how long the statute of repose is, but I think it is tied back to the 5-year USPAP record-keeping rule. A couple of other states have passed laws that allow for appraisers to perform evaluations. And of course, an evaluation is used in lieu of an appraisal for certain federally related real estate transactions that are not actually defined as federally related transactions, but there are certain types of transactions for which federal law does not require an appraisal, and instead those transactions can be consummated using instead an evaluation. And there's now, I think, 16 states that do allow appraisers to perform evaluations outside of USPAP. And there were 4 new laws passed here just in the last couple of years. Interestingly enough, Louisiana earlier this year passed a law that, much like North Carolina, reestablishes the LR credential. They see it, I think, as a way to bring more people into the profession at the licensed level, which of course has slightly lower requirements than the certified residential, and certainly different requirements than the certified general credentials. And we are continuing to monitor certain issues related to classification of workers as employees or independent contractors. This is primarily an issue for residential appraisers that do work for appraisal management companies. And there has been a push nationwide to try to curtail the independent contractor classification. And it relates primarily to the gig economy, DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, so on and so forth. And the genesis for most of these efforts was back in California a couple of years ago, where they tried to say that, or they tried to make it much more difficult for an employer to classify a worker as an independent contractor. And there was some potential for those new requirements to apply to appraisers doing work for appraisal management companies. And, I think you'll agree that neither an AMC nor the appraiser themselves wants to be an employee of an appraisal management company. It takes away a lot of the flexibility that is associated with doing work for AMCs, and a lot of the flexibility that you all cherish, and may be part of the reason why some of you came into the profession. So we're continuing to monitor that, and continuing to ensure that appraisal companies, and to some degree appraisal management companies, still have the ability to classify workers as independent contractors. But I would caution you that if you do have folks in your company that are classified as independent contractors, you may want to take a little bit of a closer look at that, because states are getting much more strict on those types of classifications. And I'm guessing that the IRS and the Department of Labor federally may also take a greater interest in how workers are classified. So certainly something for you to take a look at if you do have folks that are working for you within your appraisal companies. And with that, we have come, I think, right on time. Wow. Come to the end of our presentation. My information's there. Brian's information is there. Our boss's information is there if you want to call and complain. But you know, we're both here as a resource for you. And you know, if there are any issues that we can help you with, please feel free to reach out. Again, we're here as a resource. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all this afternoon. And Brian, I don't know if you have any closing comments that you want to offer or what.
No, but I agree. Thank you so much for having us here today. We're happy to do it again whenever, anytime in the future. Please don't hesitate to reach out with questions or follow-ups. Anything you heard today, you have any questions on, please let me know.
Yeah, we appreciate it. You know, I've gotten to work with Scott on the PAREA issue this year and trying to make sure that goes through. So as he said, we are definitely at the chapter keeping our eye on it, and hopefully, you know, nothing, you know, hopefully it goes through next year without a hitch. And but I know that we have AI leadership board of directors on here, Miles and Mike Elwell, and you know, and myself. And so this information is stuff that we need to know, you know, as chapter leaders, but it's also important, Rich Early as well. We've got, you know, stuff that we need to be in the loop on. And so I appreciate you guys taking the time. I don't know if anyone has any questions. If you want to go ahead and unmute and, you know, ask Scott and Brian a question.
Looks like we have one. Looks like we have a question there. Did you say that PAREA mentors will only be AI designated members, excuse me?
That is true for the AI PAREA program. In order to be a mentor of students that are participating in our PAREA program, you will have to be an AI designated professional. And I believe it's only MAI and SRA. I don't believe that it would, the review designations would qualify you to be a mentor. I can't speak for what the qualifications are going to be for mentors that are involved in PAREA programs from other providers, but I do know that MAI and SRA will be required for folks that want to mentor people in our program.
Yes, that is correct. I saw that it does not include the review designation. So
thank you.
Yeah. That's good to know. But yeah, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And we have recorded this. We will send it out to our members so that you know, they can.
And Vanessa, I'll also send you a copy of the PowerPoint.
Wonderful.
If you'd like to make that available. Brian, I'm assuming you're okay with that as well.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. And if you want to make that available on the chapter's website, that's fine as well.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate it. And good speaking with you today. And unless we have any other questions from anyone, I think we can, I guess we'll end our call.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great day.